everybody, it's Sarah, and today I have another review for you, and that review is of the Alainn trilogy by Anne Bishop. I have filmed the review of this trilogy before. I did a joint review with the Ephemera series by Anne Bishop. However, when I did that other review, I hadn't reread the series recently, so that review was purely on the basis of memory. Now I have reread the series this year, so I wanted to film a newer, updated review on my current thoughts, since I have changed a lot both as a person as well as a reader since I last read this series. So I want to talk about whether or not this still holds up for me. As always, we're gonna start with a little summary of the series. First of all, it's a trilogy, it's 3 books. The first of the books is The Pillars of the World, the second of the books is Shadows and Light, and the third book is The House of Gaia. This series is set in a world where you have basically Earth and you have Alainn. Earth is where humans live, and most of the story is set in a country named Silverland. Alainn is where the Fae live, and they only every now and again come down to the human world to interact with humans, and they come down via the Shining Roads. Now, at the beginning of the series, something is happening, and that is that pieces of Alainn are starting to vanish. And no one knows why this is happening, so the Fae are desperately trying to find out so that they can hopefully save their world, so that they can save Alainn. At the same time, we follow our main character, who is Ari, who is a witch, which means she can control one or more of the 4 branches of the mother, which is of course earth, fire, water and air. And Ari, in her family history, in her memory maybe even, might have the key to why Alainn is vanishing. And then also there's a group of men coming from the east, inquisitors, who are men with a mission, and that mission is to not suffer a witch to live. And they also have a very intense hatred against women. So that is the basic setup of this trilogy. So now onto my thoughts, and the first thing I want to mention is that the first book is very different from the second and third book, because the first book very much has a heavy romance focus. I wouldn't say the romance in the first book is the central plotline, because the central plotline still is finding out what's wrong with Alainn, kind of saving witches from the inquisitors, that type of stuff. However, there still is a bit of a focus on romance in this first book. The thing that's also different within the first book is that in the first book, our main character very firmly is Ari. We follow Ari, we have different POVs from other characters, but Ari is our main character, and everything around the plot centers around her. That changes in the second and third book. First of all, in the second and third book, while we do have some romantic relationships that are included, those relationships really are only subplots and side plots, and do not or barely get any focus, and only get focus insofar as it's important for the character development of a specific character. And then also the focus shifts from Ari to a lot more different characters, and so the world gets opened up a bit more, well, not a bit more, a lot more. And suddenly the focus is no longer Ari, but Silverland, the country that this is set in as a whole. So that is something that I wanted to mention, because I do think it's very interesting, and I think it's really well done, because you kind of have this opportunity. I do like that in fantasy series, by the way, where you have a lot of world building and so on. You have this opportunity where in the first book you get to know a character, and you get to know the world through their eyes and get attached to the world, and you don't get overwhelmed with too many different perspectives and too many people that you have to focus on. And then later on in the series, it slowly opens up and you're already settled firmly within the world, so that's just, you know, not as overwhelming. So I do think actually that this series is a great series for people who want to get more into adult fantasy, because it lets you in slow, and the world building also is not very complicated. There's a few elements that are often parts of tropes that we're already familiar with, even if you haven't read that much. high fantasy yet. So yeah, I definitely think this series is a great point to start. Now, I do think actually that this series maybe isn't the most amazing series for people who are already very much, you know, advanced high fantasy readers, because it can seem a bit simplistic. The world building isn't amazing, show-stopping. It serves a purpose, and it serves that purpose very well, but there's nothing really that experimental about it. There's a few elements that I really enjoyed, but those are just part of tropes that I really enjoyed. So, you know, I just think that for people who read adult high fantasy for the world building most specifically, maybe this series isn't exactly for you. I also think that this is not a series that maybe you should read after you have read another of Anne Bishop's books, unless you really like them. Because Anne Bishop is an author who very much writes the same characters and same tropes over and over again with only slight variations. So if you have already read, for example, The Black Jewels, you will find the same character archetypes and the same tropes in this series as well. And the thing is that in this series, it's a lot less complex and a lot less dynamic than it is in the Black Jewels series, for example. You do, once again, have a lot of a gender dynamic within the characters, because you have witches, you have inquisitors, you have the Fae who have their own gender dynamics. And Bishop does play with those things, but they're less advanced. Maybe advanced is the wrong word, but you know, they're less thought through, and they have less time to develop compared to the Black Jewels series. However, if you are a character-focused reader as opposed to a world-building focused reader in terms of fantasy, or too much of a story-focused reader, because I do think the story follows quite, not predictable beats, but it's also not like there's any twists and turns and anything surprising, because it's not a political fantasy. It's very much a fight against evil fantasy where, you know where it's gonna go from the very beginning onwards. However, there are, well, I wouldn't say there are no twists, but there's, there's some tragic turns within the story still. But it's not the type of fantasy that just keeps you on your toes constantly, but it's a very comforting type of fantasy story. I feel like I'm making this sound way more negative than it is, because I do really love this series. But I think it's a series, and that's why I think it's hard for me to review this, because I think it's a series that is perfect for a specific type of fantasy reader. And when I first read this series, definitely was the type of fantasy reader. I think if I read this series now, maybe I would even find it a little bit boring. Maybe I wouldn't continue on after the first book. But for the fantasy readers who sometimes do enjoy their tropey books, and who sometimes do enjoy their just kind of set in stone story beats, the very traditional, fight against evil story, not even chosen one story, because there isn't a chosen one in here, so I also wouldn't say it's a hero's journey type story. For those type of fantasy readers, I do think this can just be a very fun and easy ride. I don't think this is a series that's gonna be a favorite of all time. I think it's a series that for the moment is just always gonna be a lot of fun if it's something that you enjoy. But anyway, I was at character-focused readers. I think if you're a character-focused reader, you might really enjoy this, because Anne Bishop's character work is always very great. Yes, she does typically tend to write the same types of characters, but those characters are just very, very solid. And the strong point with Anne Bishop is always her female characters, because she just has so many different types of feminine strength within her stories. For example, Ari is a very calm and nurturing and also lonely person, but she has such an inner strength in her. Then you have Morag, who is an incredibly harsh person who's just looking for family. You have Ashk, who is maybe more of a traditional type of strong female character, in that she is powerful, she can fight, she knows how to fight. Her other form is, very, very grim, let's say it like that. I don't want to spoil anything. However, at the same time, she's also a loving mother and wife, and we do get to see those aspects of her, and those aspects and that dichotomy between those different aspects of her is talked about within the story. And that is something where I think just Anne Bishop absolutely shines, and where I think, you know, I think that's what you read her books for. And then something I also always enjoy within Anne Bishop's books, which again can be for you, can't be for you, is that her villains sometimes are a bit more stereotypical. They're maybe a little bit mustache twirling, they're a bit more two-dimensional. However, the villains aren't really, you know, the obstacles that our main characters have to face. The obstacles within Anne Bishop's books are a lot of times in group or within your own person, and the villains are just a way to manifest those and to also be a tool to bring those obstacles forth and to show those conflicts. So that's why, like, yeah, Anne Bishop's villains aren't the best, but they are like that purposefully, because they just have a specific purpose that they have to serve, and they do that really well. Then I have one last big negative, and I feel like this review was a bit all over the place today, but whatever, let's just continue on. The big last negative is that this series is very white. It was written in a time when fantasy was mostly very white, which I don't think is an excuse. I think it's a reason why I might not actively put this against the series. However, I do want to point this out because fantasy has gone so far in the past few years, so, you know, just want to make you aware that this is very white, and also that this is very cishet. Anne Bishop series are always very cishet. We have finally gotten our first sapphic character in the latest Black Jewels series. But yeah, it's also something where I'm like, this would be a lot more interesting if it were more gay. But sadly, it should not be. I mean, it's also something because Anne Bishop's stories always very not always, a lot of times, and this series definitely is one of those series, very heavily rely on gender dynamics and exploring gender dynamics. For example, in this series you have the Inquisitors, who are the men who want to oppress women, and then you have women as well as witches who, you know, fight against that, and it's a very witch's hammer, witch trials, Inquisition type storyline, very purposefully. And so I think it is very interesting and it is well done for what it is. However, my standards by now are a bit more intersectional, inclusive, and this is feminist fantasy. I would call it that because there's a lot of feminist stuff that is talked about in this series. However, it is not very intersectional feminist. So again, was written almost 20 years ago now, I think. Actually, I'm not quite sure. So yeah, the first book came out 20 years ago this year, 2021. And so it was already a time when we did talk about intersectional feminism, but it hadn't yet properly arrived in fantasy fiction. I mean, feminist fantasy, like just feminism without the intersectional, hadn't even properly arrived yet in 2001. So, you know, I just wanted to mention it once again. But yeah, the last thing I wanted to say just now before my camera gives out is that this is the type of fantasy series that is just perfect if you're looking for a bit of an old school, just very campy, fun, not too deep type of fantasy series. Once again, I feel like this review was way more negative than I had intended it to be, because I do genuinely love this series. However, I also can see why there's a lot of different types of readers who might not enjoy it as much as I do. And so if you're still interested with all I said in picking up this series, tell me in the comments down below. Also, if because of my review you're now not interested, in picking up the series. Also tell me down below if you have watched this and have never heard of this series. Also tell me in the comments down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. All the links to my social media as well as to my book club of Queens, Witches and Valkyries, where I read one adult high fantasy book written by a woman or genderqueer person per month, will also be left linked down below. And with all of that said, I hope I'll see you soon.